Well, we won't be spending like we have in the past. For 25 years, from the early 80s to the mid part of this decade, consumers spent very aggressively. They borrowed heavily and used that to finance a lot of spending. And wealthier households thought they were really wealthy and didn't need to save, and so they spent also very aggressively. I think after this crisis, this Great Recession, that has changed, and that consumers are going to be much more cautious going forward, and they'll save more. Higher income, wealthier households, because they know they're not wealthy and that values aren't going to rise as quickly as they thought. Lower middle income households, because they'll have no choice. They just can't borrow to finance their spending. So it's a sea change, an inflection point with respect to households and how they spend their money and how aggressively they spend their money. Yes. Yeah, actually, there's been a huge change in their saving behavior. If you look at their saving rates, people in their 20s and early 30s, firmly negative, right up until early 2008. Since then, it's positive, and not inconsequentially so. I mean, measurable saving. So I think even younger households are now have changed. Their thinking about the world has changed, and they're going to behave differently going forward. In part, that's on their own volition, because they realize and understand that economies don't move in a straight line, and that they need to be prepared for things when things don't go well. But part of it is being forced upon them because they're just not able to get that credit card or get that big auto loan or even that big mortgage like they did in the past. I think it. I think people are starting to think of are starting to worry about things like, are my taxes going to go up? Whose taxes are going up? Spending by the government on Medicare and on Social Security. I mean, am I going to be able to get Social Security and Medicare at 65? Am I going to get the same benefits as I've gotten in the past? So those are big questions that I think people are really now starting to ask themselves, and that does have political implications. There are many, but that would be one key implication. Well, in my view, I think it worked. I don't think it's any accident that the recession ended at just the same time that the stimulus, now I'm talking about the $787 billion package passed last February, that stimulus is now providing its maximum benefit. So the stimulus worked in that it brought this recession to an end, and it's provided a little bit of juice for the economy into the early parts of recovery. This stimulus probably isn't going to be enough to push the recovery into a self-sustaining economic expansion, and that's where we are right now. It's a little bit tricky, and so we may need to see more, the government may need to provide more help to make sure that transition does actually occur. But the intent of the stimulus was to end the recession, get a recovery going, and in my view, it worked. Well, it's a good question. I mean, we can look at individual aspects of the stimulus package and then look at the parts of the economy to which that stimulus would have an impact. So, for example, the cash for clunkers. We know that had a huge effect on vehicle sales and helped turn around vehicle production and employment in the vehicle sector. The first-time home buyer tax credit. The housing market stabilized this summer. House prices actually have risen a little bit in the last few months. Now, there are many reasons for that, all of them policy related, but one of the key policy aspects that helped the market was the first-time home buyer credit. Consumer spending stabilized, and consumers got tax cuts, Social Security recipients got checks, so I think it helped there play a role. And state government, without the help from the feds, states would have been cutting. Let me just give you a statistic. In the year ending in the second quarter of 2009, state and local tax revenues fell by $120 billion. On a percentage basis, we've never seen anything like that, $120 billion. And in that same year, aid from the federal government to state and local governments increased by $110 billion. So almost a complete offset, not complete, and so states and localities have been cutting programs and jobs and raising taxes because they still have a budget hole. But could you imagine what they'd be going through if they had not gotten that help. So, you have to think about what the world would have looked like without the stimulus. You got to construct a counterfactual. But in the case of state government, I don't think that's that's very hard to do. You ask any governor, and they'll pretty much tell you that the stimulus was very important to keeping their budgets together as well as they were kept together. I think, though, if you go back to '06, there's a broad-based belief that house prices would not decline, at least across the nation. There would be regions of the country, California perhaps, and New York, maybe Florida, where we see some price declines, but nothing that would encompass the entire national housing market and get outright price declines. I mean, I can remember we do a lot of house price forecasting for our clients, and in '06, at some point we forecasted that national house prices were going to decline in '07, not by a lot, but by a little bit, a couple 3 percentage point decline, and that was a big change and created a lot of angst among a lot of our clients, saying how can that possibly be the case? So, of course, it was a couple 3%. It ended up being 30% plus. So I think there was this general view based on our historical experience that this just couldn't happen, at least not to the scale that obviously ultimately did occur. Now I have to say, unfortunately, in our models, some of the models were saying, because the models are based on looking at house prices relative to people's incomes and house prices relative to effective apartment rents, the models wanted to say bigger price declines in some big markets. But I didn't even believe it. I had a hard time digesting what the models were telling me. And I felt like if I came out and said prices were going to decline, that was a big enough statement, and I didn't have to say they were going to decline by 20 to 30%, because then you lose credibility. And that's also part of the problem in this period, because for a number of years, people, good economists, were arguing that house prices were getting inflated. It was speculative, that in all likelihood we'd at least see them go flat or decline. But if you say that, say in '05, and prices continue to rise by double digits, and then you said it again in '06 and prices rise again double digits, then you lose credibility and no one listens. And so that became a problem. And that's not atypical of a bubble, but that's exactly what happened. A lot of us lost credibility because we had been arguing that this wasn't sustainable, but we started arguing that too early. Well, a number of things. I think it's at the root of it was a very new and complex process of financing mortgage lending and other lending altogether. The process of securitization, which, at its core, I think has value and is a good thing. It provides for the more efficient allocation of savings into investment. But I think the problem is no one really understood the process from start to finish. You had the originators making the loans who were focused on what they did. You had the investment banks buying the loans and packaging them into securities, and they focused on what they did. You had the rating agencies kind of looking at the securities and deciding, how's this going to work, and they were focused on what they did. The regulators were, focused on individual aspects of this process, but no one was looking at it holistically and saying, is this, going to work? Does it make sense? And at the end of the day, we made a lot of bad loans because the process didn't make sense. I think industry executives, they weren't looking at it in a broad sense, and they were only focused on their aspect of the process, so they really didn't consider everything in its totality. And regulators the same way. Now, the other problem regulators had was there was a general view in regulatory circles that that the market would figure it out. In a sense, the regulators were thinking that the CEOs had it figured out and that they didn't need to do much oversight or really consider what the CEOs were doing. But the CEOs, in fact, weren't. Because of the way the securitization process was structured, no one really was focused on the entire system, and regulators didn't understand that. But That they thought that the market was working properly, that the CEOs would get it right, and of course that was wrong. Well, I think to some degree that happens now. I mean, all the folks that work at various investment houses, buy-side analysts, do spend a lot of time and energy trying to understand the risk characteristics of bonds and determining whether they're good investments or not. So that happens already. They take the ratings as one other opinion in their decision-making process whether to make an investment. I think going back to securitization, that was complex. That was more difficult for analysts at these investment houses to evaluate, in part because they didn't have all the information and data, in part because the securities were really very difficult to understand, and so they didn't have the same kind of level of understanding. They didn't do the same kind of due diligence as they did for, let's say, a municipal bond or for a corporate bond or a sovereign bond. But I think that's going to change going forward. If there ever is another structured finance deal that's done, you'll see a lot more analysis put into it. I don't. I think there's a function for rating agencies because, in a sense, there is a lot of disparate information, and bringing it all together is very costly, and doing good analysis is difficult, and you need scale to do it. And some bond houses are gaining that scale and doing it on their own. There's the PIMCOs of the world and other big bond houses that have the scale necessary to put together the staff to do the kind of analysis that needs to get done. But many other investors don't have that scale, and the rating agencies, in a sense, provide that for them. And so there are scale economies in that kind of analysis, and in a sense the rating agencies provide that. Also, there's a lot of more esoteric kinds of bonds and securities that are issued, and it always will make sense to have, I think, something like a rating agency providing an opinion as to the quality of that particular bond or that security. So I think there's an economic reason for rating agencies. So I think they'll always be around. Obviously the role is going to change as a result of events, but I think there'll always be a role for them. Well, it happened in fourth grade. I did a project on why was Detroit the center of the vehicle industry. This was a fourth grade project. And I remember it was a group project, and I enjoyed it tremendously. And I didn't know what an economist was in fourth grade, but I knew that I wanted to do something like that. And so from that time on, I sort of focused on things related to business and economics. So I remember that day, and I remember that project, and I remember how much I enjoyed it, and I thought I was good at it. I thought I had insight, and so from that day forward, I was headed towards being an economist. Yeah, I do. I think it's not taught properly at high school. If I were teaching in high school, I'd focus on personal finance issues. When I got out of high school, I could make a pretty good omelet, but I didn't even know what a mortgage was. And I think that's a mistake. I think that's one of the reasons why we're in the mess we're in, why all those millions of bad loans were made, because people really truly did not understand what they were getting into. So I think the high school curriculum should change, and home economics should be more about the economics than the home, I think. That'd be my view. And then I think in universities, it tends to be, the teaching is sort of moved towards the highly theoretical, very mathematically oriented, and it kind of loses touch with the reality of what's happening really in our economy, in the real world. And I think that's to the detriment of the profession and its relevancy to our everyday life. So I think it's important that universities at least make an effort to get back to more practically oriented kinds of economic analysis, or at least doing economic theory that they can ground in terms of into something that's practical. I think we've lost that and are losing that, and there are very few economists that really can step out of the theoretical world and really make an impact on what's happening to people's daily lives. Well, right now what keeps me up at night is the fact that businesses seem to be still very, they're not panicked, but they're very, very cautious, unusually cautious. And I guess it's understandable because many business people suffered near-death experiences in the last year and just aren't stepping up. And the longer they wait to step up and begin to invest and begin to hire, the more likely this recovery that we're now in unravels back into a recession. And if we get back into recession, I don't think it's going to be easy to get out. People's wages will start to decline. We'll be engulfed in a deflationary cycle. We've already used up most of our policy ammunition. The funds rate target is at 0, and we have a $1.4 trillion budget deficit. So we have to guard against that, and it worries me that businesses haven't gotten their groove back, at least not yet.